When Lena Odom recalled that period of her life, she always said it had been like walking with her feet sinking into ground that no longer belonged to her. She was 68 years old, her skin marked by small sunspots, and she wore a false serenity that barely concealed the emptiness left after losing Elijah, her husband of 45 years. She still lived in the red brick house where they had raised their son, a house filled with faded photographs, plants she insisted on caring for even though they died easily, and a kitchen that smelled of reheated coffee. Back then, everything she did was automatic: watering the plants, opening the curtains, checking the mail, sitting in the armchair where Elijah always watched the news. But on the day of the funeral, that day when life seemed to have taken a turn for the worse, she couldn't stop mentally repeating that something was out of place, as if her story had been taken by other hands and rewritten without her consent. From the moment she arrived at the funeral home, Lena felt she wasn't grieving her own loss, but rather witnessing a performance staged by her son Marcus and daughter-in-law Kira. He walked among the wreaths with measured steps, recounting the story of Elijah's sudden death like a news anchor, while Kira stood center stage beside the closed casket, offering tissues and apologies for Lena's supposed emotional fragility. People approached, but not her. They touched Kira's arm, praised her strength, and asked Marcus how she could bear so much now that her father was gone. Every time Lena tried to speak, Kira interrupted her with a kind but empty smile, answering for her, summarizing feelings she had no right to express. It was there, amidst creaking chairs, flowers wilting too quickly, and an air conditioner that made more noise than it cooled, that Lena understood she had somehow been displaced from her own place in the world. When the funeral ended, Lena returned home with the feeling that the silence wasn't silence at all, but a space filled with something dense, almost sticky, that wouldn't let her breathe. Marcus and Kira insisted on accompanying her so she wouldn't be alone, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, they began talking as if they had already decided her fate without consulting her. Kira opened the curtains and remarked that the house was too big for one person, while Marcus wandered through each room with his hands in his pockets, mentally taking notes on the objects, as if they were assets to be inventoried. Lena, who had always had a commanding presence, was surprised to hear her own voice fall weak when she asked if they could leave her alone for a moment. They exchanged a rehearsed glance, a mixture of pity and authority, and told her they only wanted what was best for her, a phrase repeated so often it began to sound like a veiled threat. That evening, Marcus and Kira sat across from her in the living room, as if in an administrative meeting, and formally proposed moving her to a senior living community. It wasn't a suggestion. It was pressure disguised as concern. Lena noticed an uneasy glint in her daughter-in-law's eyes, a kind of impatient urgency that was completely out of character with her recent bereavement. Marcus, for his part, spoke in a gentle tone, almost infantilizing her, as if she were incapable of making her own decisions after decades of managing the household and caring for everyone. When Lena refused, the atmosphere became tense in a way that made her skin crawl. Kira began to insinuate that she shouldn't be alone, while Marcus vaguely mentioned security and risks. It was then that Lena felt for the first time a different kind of fear, not of the future, but of the people who shared her blood. That same night, when she finally managed to be alone in her own house, Lena felt that the silence had sharp edges. She walked slowly down the hallway, touching the picture frames with her fingers, as if searching for confirmation that she still belonged there. Marcus's words kept echoing in her head. "It's not safe. It's better for you. You can't carry all this anymore." She couldn't understand how this same son, whom she had taught to tie his shoelaces and overcome his fear of the dark, now spoke of her as if she were an old piece of furniture that was in the way. She turned on the kitchen light and saw a folded brochure for a nursing home on the table. She didn't remember seeing it before, and the thought that Kira had left it there during the funeral made her shudder. It was as if everything had been planned. Lena tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter-in-law's expression, that neat, calculated gesture that always concealed something she never quite deciphered. She remembered small moments she had previously ignored. Kira's comments about her memory, the times she insisted that Lena was confused, the quick glances between her and Marcus. When Lena struggled to find a word, sitting on the bed, the yellowish light from the lamp reflecting off the wrinkles in her hands, she understood that there were signs she had never wanted to see. And as she listened to the insistent ticking of the clock in the hallway, a dark premonition pierced her chest. Something more serious was afoot, something Elijah had tried to tell her in his weary silences over the past few months, without her understanding in time. The next day, just as Lena was trying to find some semblance of normalcy by making an overly strong coffee, the phone rang with an urgency that made the table vibrate. Seeing the name on the screen, Theodore Vance, Elijah's boss, her stomach sank. He never called her, much less in the early hours of the morning. She answered, her voice trembling, and the first thing she heard was a tense whisper, asking her not to mention anything to Marcus or Kira. Theodore insisted on seeing her that very day, privately, because there were important matters concerning Elijah that couldn't wait. Lena stood still, holding the phone with both hands, as if it were incredibly heavy. For a moment she thought there might be a mistake, but the gravity in Theodore's voice erased any doubt. Something wasn't right, and it was clear he knew more than he'd let on at the funeral. When he hung up, Lena felt a strange chill, not so much from the urgency of the call, but because deep down it seemed to confirm the dark feeling she'd had the night before. She leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath, and remembered Elijah telling her weeks earlier not to trust calm appearances too much. That phrase, lost among so many others they had shared over decades, now shone like a belated warning. As she got ready to leave, she thought about how many people go through similar situations without realizing it until it's too late. And if anyone reading this has experienced something similar, well, if you've made it this far, comment where you're reading from. Sometimes knowing there are other voices around makes you feel less alone. With that thought weighing heavily on her, Lena grabbed her bag and headed out to the building where Elijah had worked for over 20 years. When Lena arrived at the office building, the security guard, a burly man with thick eyebrows and a mustache that looked like it had been drawn on with a marker, recognized her immediately and let her in without asking any questions. The elevator ascended in nigh a dry silence, broken only by the whir of the motor and the slight tremor of the structure. Stepping out into the 7th-floor hallway, Lena was greeted by the familiar scent of aged paper and fresh ink, an aroma Elijah always carried on his clothes. Theodore Vance was waiting for her in front of a half-open door, fidgeting with his fingers, as if trying to release all his pent-up tension. When he saw her, he gestured quickly for her to come in and close the door. His expression was so serious that Lena felt the air in the room change temperature. Theodore's office seemed less like a workplace and more like a room filled with poorly kept secrets. On the desk were stacks of folders, an antique tape recorder, a glass of cold coffee, and a manila envelope with Elijah's name written on it by hand. Without preamble, he explained that, over the past few months, Elijah had been gathering documents, notes, and evidence related to some troubling behavior from Marcus and Kira. Lena listened, her heart pounding in her ribs, unsure if she wanted to hear any more. Theodore spoke of suspicious visits to the house when she wasn't there, attempts to get Elijah to sign papers without her consent, insinuations that she had memory problems, and constant pressure to have her declared unfit. It was as if each word fit into a puzzle she never imagined existed, a puzzle where the pieces formed a betrayal impossible to immediately comprehend. Lena felt her legs give way, so she leaned on the edge of the desk as Theodore opened a thick folder filled with dates, questionable signatures, and notes written in Elijah's firm handwriting. Each page revealed a detail more disturbing than the last. Proxy requests Elijah had rejected, Kira's attempts to convince doctors to evaluate Lena's cognitive decline, and even call logs where Marcus insisted his mother couldn't go on alone. It was like reading a diary of warnings Elijah had silently written, waiting for the right moment to protect her. Theodore explained that Elijah feared the manipulation would escalate into something more serious, that the couple would try to isolate her completely. And then Lena understood that her husband had seen what she, out of love or naivete, had chosen not to notice. Theodore paused for a long time before continuing, as if searching for the least painful words for what was to come. He cleared his throat and pointed to the bathroom door at the back of the office. A small door with a faded sign that barely read private. Lena thought perhaps he wanted her to calm down, to breathe for a moment, but as soon as the door opened, something inside her broke. There was Elijah, alive, standing, his face tense and his eyes glazed over, like someone who had carried an unbearable secret for far too long. Lena automatically clutched her chest, unable to utter a word. Elijah approached slowly, explaining that he hadn't died, that the autopsy had never happened, that it had all been staged to protect her. His voice trembled as he confessed that faking his own death had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but also the most necessary. Elena froze, as if her body had forgotten how to react. The image of Elijah alive, right there, breathing in front of her, mingled with the memory of the closed coffin in the funeral home, the withered flowers, and Kira's hands receiving condolences in his place. Elijah took her shoulders with an almost fearful gentleness, repeating that he hadn't had any other choice. He had uncovered enough evidence to understand that Marcus and Kira weren't just trying to manipulate them emotionally, but also to financially exploit them and force her into institutionalization. Elijah's voice trembled as he admitted that he feared Lena would be harmed while he was still alive. Faking his death had been the only way to get them both to let their guard down. Lena didn't know whether to hug him or scream. All her grief, all her pain, all her loneliness had been real, even if death wasn't. When she finally managed to sit down, Elijah and Theodore began showing her the full evidence. Recordings of Marcus arguing with Kira about how to get ahead of the inheritance, manipulated bank statements, emails in which Kira tried to bribe a doctor to diagnose non-existent dementia, and even 3 credit cards opened in Lena's name without her consent. There was also a transcript of a conversation that chilled Lena to the bone, Marcus saying that Elijah wouldn't be a problem for long. In that instant, she understood that this wasn't a family misunderstanding or a boundary dispute. It was a meticulous and dangerous conspiracy, and she had been unwittingly at its center. Elijah explained how they had enlisted a complicit funeral director and a trusted doctor to fake the death without raising suspicion. Every detail added an unbearable weight to Lena's heart. Lena felt the air in the office becoming too heavy for her lungs. She stared at the documents, spread across the table like someone examining the shards of broken glass. She knew they belonged to her life, but they no longer fit the way she remembered it. Elijah went on to explain how, for weeks, he had noticed that Marcus and Kira's visits always coincided with times when Lena wasn't home, and how the two of them insisted on going through documents, drawers, and correspondence. They had even tried to convince him to sign a partial transfer of the house to avoid future problems. Each word reopened a wound, not only because of the betrayal, but because of the certainty that her own son had crossed a moral line Lena never thought possible. Nothing in her motherhood had prepared her to face the evidence that Marcus saw her as an obstacle, not as a mother. Theodore added that, in the final weeks before orchestrating her faked death, Elijah began to notice inconsistencies in the bank transactions. Unfamiliar charges appeared on Lena's card, some linked to stores where she had never set foot. He also discovered cash withdrawals from branches near Kira's workplace. To make matters worse, one day Elijah found a note in his son's pocket with sports betting figures and a total of $150,000 in debt. All of this wove a knot of desperation that might explain the ambition, but didn't justify it. Lena listened without blinking, her fingers clasped together and cold, feeling each revelation tear away a piece of the image she had constructed of her family. It was as if she were suddenly forced to look at a dark version of Marcus that had always been there, hidden behind a polite smile. Elijah took a deep breath before showing her the last file, one he had tried to save for last because he knew it would be the most painful blow for her. It was an audio recording, brief but devastating, in which Marcus's voice could be clearly heard, frustrated, saying that Mom won't last long on her own, and that the sooner they sort out the legal capacity issue, the better for everyone. Lena felt a chill run down her spine like a line of ice. It was confirmation of something no mother ever wants to hear, that her own son had begun to consider her death a convenient option. She brought her hands to her face, trying to stifle a sob that wasn't born of helplessness, but of a different kind of grief. The grief for the son she thought she knew. Elijah, his eyes shining, came to hold her hands, but Lena wasn't sure she wanted comfort. It was too much, too fast, and too hard to process. Theodore intervened then, his voice firm but empathetic, making it clear that they weren't there just to show her the horror, but to plan a safe way out. He explained that the only reason the conspiracy hadn't progressed further was Elijah's caution and the growing distrust he felt when Marcus insisted on speeding things up. Elijah added that, had he not faked his death, Marcus and Kira would probably have already tried to pull legal strings to have Lena declared legally incompetent, using the supposed grief as an emotional weapon to justify hasty decisions. Suddenly, Lena understood the magnitude of what had happened. Her husband had vanished from the world to save her. As she watched them both, Elijah with deep, dark circles under his eyes, and Theodore with a protective gaze, she felt something inside her ignite for the first time since the funeral. Not exactly hope, but a spark of clarity that announced she was no longer a victim of a story written by others. As the first wave of shock began to subside, Lena felt rage rising from a deep, ancient place within her. It wasn't impulsive anger, but a dense one, filled with years of silences she had mistaken for domestic peace. She sat up slowly and asked to hear the recording again. This time she didn't cry. An expression appeared on her face that Elijah hadn't seen in decades. The expression of the woman who, many years ago, had rebuilt her life from scratch after losing her parents and raising Marcus. Practically alone, this woman wasn't trembling, this woman was analyzing. When the recording ended for the second time, Lena looked up and said with chilling calm that she wanted to confront her son. Elijah and Theodore exchanged a worried glance, but they knew they couldn't stop her. The time had come to break down the facade. The confrontation happened that very afternoon. Marcus arrived at Theodore's house unaware that Lena and Elijah were there. He walked in smiling with the arrogant confidence of someone who thinks he controls the entire board. But the smile crumbled when he saw his father alive. First, he paled. Then he began to stammer out absurd excuses about a medical mix-up, trying to piece together a story that had never existed. Lena watched every micro-expression on his face, searching for traces of the boy she had raised, but found only the restless mask of a cornered man. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was neither weak nor trembling. It was firm, as if each word carried the weight of all the pain he had caused her. She asked him why he wanted to have her declared legally incompetent, why he needed her house, why he was lying, and Marcus, unable to maintain the charade, finally broke down in recriminations, blaming her for not making things easier. Marcus quickly shifted from guilt to anger, as if his rage could somehow mask the mounting evidence. He raised his voice, accusing Lena of being selfish, of not understanding the needs of a modern family, and finally uttered the phrase that shattered the atmosphere, that they were just getting a head start on what would one day be theirs anyway. Lena sensed that those words didn't come from the grown man in front of her, but from an inner rift he had allowed to fester for years. Elijah, his face tense, demanded that Marcus admit the truth, and the ensuing silence was more revealing than any explanation. It confirmed that it hadn't been an impulse, nor a mistake, but a conscious decision. Lena, with a calmness that only emerges when there is nothing left to protect, told him that this wasn't her son, at least not the son she had raised. By the time Kira arrived, alerted by the urgent tone of Marcus's message, the scene was already on the verge of collapse. She tried to hug him, but he pushed her away roughly, accusing her of having pushed him too far. And within seconds, they were both blaming each other. Theodore, from the sidelines, watched as if witnessing the structural collapse of a building constructed on lies. Elijah waited for the voices to quiet down before laying all the evidence on the table. The charges on the credit cards, the falsified rulings, the recordings, the attempts at legal manipulation. Kira first denied, then cried, then offered flimsy explanations about misinterpretation, but the evidence was too solid. Slowly, what they had wanted to hide came to light with devastating clarity. Lena didn't feel relief. She felt a deep sadness as she watched ambition obliterate any bond that had once united them. The argument ended when Marcus, exhausted of excuses and faced with undeniable evidence, slumped in a chair, his gaze unfocused. He was no longer shouting. He looked more like a punished child, unable to grasp the magnitude of his own actions. Elijah stood rigidly, as if he needed that posture to avoid breaking. Lena, on the other hand, felt a strange surge of clarity. She was no longer fighting to get her son back, but to reclaim her dignity. She told Marcus there would be no more second chances until he faced the legal consequences of what he had done. He tried to approach her, but Lena took a step back, a small but decisive gesture. With that simple movement, she understood that she was no longer an emotional hostage to her own maternal bond. The following days were a mix of legal proceedings, depositions, and meetings with lawyers. Elijah had to answer for his faked death, receiving a reduced sentence. Thanks to his cooperation with the prosecution and the compelling evidence he provided, Marcus was formally charged with fraud and financial abuse, receiving 18 months of probation and the obligation to undergo mandatory therapy. Kira, for her part, lost her nursing license after it was confirmed that she had tried to bribe a doctor to falsely diagnose Lena with dementia. She also faced charges for her involvement in the illegal opening of credit cards. For Lena, however, the most painful part wasn't the legal process, but accepting that it had all been orchestrated by the very people she had loved and protected for decades. It was a different kind of grief, quieter and more real than any funeral. When the initial legal proceedings finally concluded, Lena and Elijah were confronted with a silence entirely different from the one they had experienced months before. It was no longer a silence imposed by fear, but one that demanded rebuilding. The house where they had lived for almost half a century had become a constant reminder of the betrayal, so they decided to sell it. As they packed the last of their belongings, a blue vase that had always been in the living room, the embroidered tablecloth Lena used at Christmas, the old letters Elijah had written during his business trips, she felt a mixture of relief and melancholy. That house held beautiful stories, but also scars. And if anyone is reading this and has made it this far, share this story with someone who needs a sign that there is always a way out, even when betrayal comes from the most unexpected places. It was with that thought in her heart that Lena closed the door on her old life for the last time. Redwood Springs welcomed them with the kind of tranquility that only exists in places where no one is in a hurry. It was a small town, surrounded by tall pines that seemed to touch the sky, and streets so quiet you could hear the leaves crunching under your shoes. Lena surprised herself by breathing better, as if her lungs had been compressed for years. Elijah found solace in the simple routine. Morning walks, conversations with curious neighbors, drinking coffee in a cafe where everyone remembered names. Lena, for her part, began to rebuild something deeper, her independence. She started reading again, cooking just for the joy of it, dressing without worrying about anyone's opinion. Slowly, she understood that freedom doesn't always feel like an explosion. Sometimes it arrives like a long sigh after surviving a shipwreck. Over time, Lena began to notice small gestures that revealed how much her inner life had changed. She no longer walked with her eyes on the ground, nor did she hesitate before making simple decisions like what to buy for dinner or which path to take during her morning walks. She even picked up a forgotten habit, writing in a notebook. Not about pain, but about what she saw from her window. A squirrel stealing blackberries, an old man who always tipped his hat in greeting, a little girl flying a bright yellow kite that was impossible to miss. Elijah watched her with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. He knew she was recovering something she hadn't even known she'd lost. And although they both carried scars, they began to talk about the future with a calmness that had once seemed unattainable. One day, while organizing a box she had avoided opening since the move, Lena found a photograph of Marcus as a child, holding a paper airplane he had folded himself. The image struck her with a gentle pain, less sharp than before. She didn't cry. She simply held it between her fingers for a long time. Elijah approached and asked if she wanted to keep the photo or throw it away. She decided to keep it, not as a symbol of immediate hope, but as a reminder that a part of her son had existed without that shadow of ambition and selfishness. Accepting that was like releasing a burden that wasn't hers to bear. She understood that she could move on without erasing what she had lived through, without denying her motherhood, but also without condemning herself to repeat the same pain over and over again. A few more months passed, and when life had settled into an almost peaceful rhythm, Lena received a letter from Marcus. She didn't open it immediately. She left it on the kitchen table for 2 days, glancing at it whenever she passed by. She was afraid it was another attempt at manipulation, but she also feared it was an apology she wouldn't know how to handle. Finally, one morning, with the sound of the wind gently tapping against the windows, she decided to open it. Marcus's handwriting was uneven, as if he had written in haste or with trembling hands. In the first paragraph, he admitted some of the blame, acknowledging that gambling debt had consumed him and that he had lost control of his own life. Although he didn't justify anything, the mere admission was already a change. The letter went on to talk about mandatory therapy, about sessions, where he had begun to understand his unhealthy need to deserve what others had, a vested entitlement problem, as he called it. Lena read it all without interruption, feeling that each line opened a small window onto a possible future, but not an immediate one. In the last part, Marcus said that he wasn't expecting a response, but that he wanted her to know he was trying to change. Lena folded the letter carefully, not with emotion, but with a firm serenity. She decided to keep it, just as she had kept the photo, not as a bridge to reconciliation, but as a record that the story hadn't ended completely, even if it had necessarily. She knew there was a way back for him, but she also knew she couldn't walk it for him. In the days that followed, Lena noticed something inside her had shifted after reading the letter. It wasn't blind hope, nor a desire for immediate reconciliation. It was more of a mature understanding that some wounds don't need to be snapped shut to stop bleeding. Elijah, ever attentive, asked if she wanted to reply, but Lena gently shook her head. She said words were easy. The hard part was sustaining new actions long enough to demonstrate real change, and she no longer lived according to what Marcus decided to do with his own life. For the first time in decades, Lena felt that her well-being didn't depend on anyone's approval, presence, or validation. She owned her silence, her days, and her decisions. With this newfound clarity, Lena began to participate in simple activities she wouldn't have considered before. She joined a small community gardening group where she learned to grow lavender and prune old rose bushes. The evenings were filled with light conversation about plants, pets, and homemade bread recipes. She also befriended a neighbor named Marjorie, a woman with fluffy white hair and a contagious laugh that seemed to pierce any gray cloud. Sometimes Lena would find herself laughing for no reason, as if her body remembered how to feel light after carrying so much weight. The whole town was beginning to see her not as a woman scarred by betrayal, but as someone who had been reborn from a devastating truth and had chosen life. As the months passed, Lena and Elijah found a routine that brought them something resembling harmony. In the mornings, they would walk together along a path surrounded by tall pines, where the scent of fresh resin was almost therapeutic. On these walks, they talked about everything and nothing, the weather, recipes they wanted to try, books they had read years ago. But inevitably, there were days when the silence between them held unspoken questions, memories that surfaced like soft shadows. Elijah, however, never pressured her. He knew that Lena needed to rebuild herself from within, without haste or demands. All he did was walk beside her, step by step, as he had for most of their 45 years together. One afternoon, while they drank tea on the porch of their new house, a small but cozy porch, adorned with geraniums Lena had rescued from a neglected pot, she confessed something she'd been feeling for weeks, that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. Not because everything was settled, or because life had become perfect again, but because she had discovered her own strength. Lena understood that she couldn't control whether her son would change or not, whether they would ever speak again, or whether the distance would be permanent, but she could control how she would live her own days, calmly, honestly, and with a freedom she never imagined she would regain. Elijah took her hand, and for a moment they shared a silence that didn't hurt, a silence that finally tasted like home. The final closure came unexpectedly one autumn morning, when the air carried that scent of dry leaves that always reminded her of her childhood. Lena was watering the porch plants when she felt something inside her settle, like a piece, finally falling into place after years of aimless wandering. She hadn't heard from Marcus since the letter, but she no longer carried that weight like an open wound. Now it was just a painful chapter that had pushed her, by force, toward a more authentic life. As she watched the sun filter through the trees, she understood that peace doesn't always come with answers, but with acceptance. She silently gave thanks for Elijah, for Theodore, for Redwood Springs, and above all, for having had the courage to keep going when everything had fallen apart. That afternoon, sitting in the porch rocking chair with a warm cup of coffee in her hands, Lena made a final decision that would mark the true end of her story. She wouldn't answer Marcus's letter, at least not for now. If one day he showed a sincere and lasting change, perhaps they could build something new from the ruins. But forgiveness wouldn't be automatic or obligatory. Her life was no longer dictated by the redemption of others, but by her own. And so, as the wind gently stirred the geraniums and Elijah approached with a blanket to cover her legs, Lena took a deep breath and smiled. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived there months before, broken inside. Now she was someone who had survived an unthinkable betrayal and had found, at the end of the road, a serenity she never thought possible. It was a rebirth. It was freedom. She was herself at last.